I'll say all right in a minute. It's good opening. Welcome to Common Grounds Coffeehouse, everyone. It's great to have you here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Eshelman. I am one of the leaders of EMU's Sustainable Food Initiative. Tonight we are excited to raise awareness about one part of campus that is aiming to have more sustainable practices and be more socially responsible in their business, and that's Common Grounds. Most of us who are students here now are not aware of how things have worked with Lucas Roasting Company in the past, but that was a very intentional shift from what we used to serve here in Common Grounds, and so we're excited to share with more students about, students of community. For those of you who aren't students here, welcome. But we're excited to have Lucas Roasting Company and Jamie here as well. And Jamie's going to start us off this evening as he talks about the starting of the coffee process. And we'll kind of carry it from growth to it being in your cup tonight. So, I also want to just note that we're very excited that we were able to work with Earth Keepers, which is another EMU club, as well as Peace Fellowship. And so they're both, we worked together on this one. So, Jamie, welcome. Okay.
Good evening, y'all. Is it working?
Yeah.
Great. Good to see you guys. My name is Jaime Miller. I'm going to start with a little bit about who I am, so it ties me in a little bit to who you are, and where this coffee, some of the coffee at least that we're drinking tonight, comes from. I am a Mennonite. Some of you guys know some of those. I went to EMU. I'm a grad from here. I studied JPCS. When I was done studying JPCS, I went into MCC, and I went to Nicaragua. And when I was in Nicaragua, I started working with a group of nuns there, and they had a small farm where they did kind of therapy, let's say work therapy with young addicts, and a small farm up in a high area. So I went, and at some point I switched from working with addicts on the street to running a small farm. And I did that for about 3 years as an MCCer. I was an MCCer in the end for almost 4.5, 5 years. At the end of those 5 years, I married a young Nicaraguan lady, beautiful Nicaraguan lady, Evelyn, my wife, and we bought a little coffee farm. So I've been running a coffee farm for about the last 9 years. About 2 or 3 years ago, my father-in-law and mother-in-law moved out to the farm. We're just south of Managua and San Marcos Carazo, and we've been running the farm together as a family now for about 2 or 3 years. And so that's kind of, I've come into coffee kind of maybe in the same way Lucas and I share some things. One of our things is a vision for seeing a different world. And as we've had experiences in other cultures and in the world, we've seen that how coffee is kind of interwoven and is an example of, at least in Nicaragua, the culture. It weaves through the last 300 years of culture, through the Spanish conquista, through the farms that are run there, through the way that indigenous people have been treated, through environmental issues, through politics, through why immigrants without their paperwork are showing up in the U.S. And any of all of those would be fair and open game for any questions. I'm going to try to leave you guys a lot of space for questions and to ask anything you really want. I was told that tonight's all about asking questions, and I said, oh, this is the perfect night for me then, because I always have a lot of questions. But I'm coming here on the side of trying to give the perspective of farmers, of local farmers, and then I'm going to pass it on to Troy a little bit later, and Troy is the one who runs, Troy and Jenica are the ones who run Lucas Roasting, and they're going to talk a little bit more about coffee as it comes to the U.S. and this side of it. So, if you could cue up that little presentation, I probably did the first part of this little presentation. OCP, our community place, asked me to do a little talk about coffee, and I did a presentation kind of along these same lines. More focused, obviously, a little bit on my story, so we jump through that real quick. If you could skip through, that's me and my son, Sammy. He's growing up on the farm. This is one of the first plants that I planted about 4 years ago that had its first harvest last year, so that's kind of like something that really made me proud. So that plant up on the right there. And we also have a whole group of kind of neighbors and friends who work together. For me, the reason we bought the farm, it was a way of buying into a community. It was a way of, our vision is, I guess I could say, for those of you who've worked in development or studying JPCS, after working at an NGO desk for a while, it got fairly frustrating, especially for somebody like me who's not much of a desk person. And I needed a way that I could feel I was really making a change or doing something I felt, even if it was the smallest grain, at least it was in the right direction. Because often, I so often felt, even with the best of organizations, that sometimes my steps were going backwards. So, the farm began, there was a group of 6 young, all of us were kind of social workers working with people. We started looking at why were all these people showing up in Managua? Why were people leaving farms? Why are there so many problems with gangs and drugs and violence? We were seeing the deterioration of the rural communities and all these people kind of showing up in Managua. And we started talking about economics, talking about sociology, and we were seeing that a lot of the roots were coming from people leaving their homes because their way of life was not sustainable anymore. The small farm, which is still the base of Nicaraguan economy, is really hard to keep running. In the 90s, early 92, there was a price drop in coffee for 2 or 3 years where the price was about a third the price to produce it. And many small farmers left at that point and took off from the countryside, left their homes, left their families, went to the city. They end up doing a lot of jobs that they don't know, that aren't sustainable for them still, but make their life very difficult, let's say, in many ways, and no community support as they had when they were in the communities. So you can see a little bit about that. So this was development as a lifestyle, I guess, is a new way of, we were thinking about. You do something positive that you're interested in and let it go out and affect the community that's around you. So honestly, we probably haven't done anything, like a lot of you probably think, oh yeah, it's this farm, permaculture, all these cool. We honestly didn't do any of that. The first tests we're doing with that is this year. I've run the farm now for about 10 years, 9 years. Basically what we did is I went and lived in my neighbor's corn crib for about 2 years, and with them learned how he plants coffee, which included putting on some little agrochemicals to make them grow. Usually they have so little money, they don't do money pesticides or anything like that. And really learning how they do things. And we're finally trying to propose, oh, let's get a pulper. Nobody has a pulper. We can't sell our coffee at a fair price because the middlemen come and get it to us in cherry. You'll see a cherry here in a couple seconds. And so by doing this problem solving, that wasn't possible. They didn't have money. There was no way they could put capital in the pulper. There's no water. There was no way we could build a well. How do you start responding to these things as a community? Those are the challenges that we're facing, and that's what the last 8 years has been all about. Now we're kind of at a point we've been forced to come to the U.S., so we're looking at the U.S. and trying to meet back where we've been working from Nicaragua this way. Now we're coming to the U.S. and we're going to work back and see what do you do with the coffee once it's here then, to make that community work that we're doing sustainable. So that's a little bit about that, if you can flip the page. So we're going to talk about how, the part I'm doing is how is coffee grown, and the whole thing is how it gets to your table. Troy's going to talk more about the second half, right? You can see planting up here. Those are coffee seeds. We usually make a little banquillo. It's probably about the size of half the stage. And every inch we'll put a line like that, and every inch we'll plant a little seed. It will turn into copilla, or sometimes, which is this little thing on the right. Those have been pulled out into the soil. They get loosened up. They get pulled out and they get put in bags. And then those bags are tended under shade. You can see some guys tending bags up there in the shade. And then that gets planted out usually in about June. So once that plant goes out, it's 5 years till that plant will grow up into a bush big enough to give coffee, which you'll see kind of at the right. That's a full-grown bush that will be giving coffee. And that plant will last more or less Big farms will do it every 15 to 20 years. Poor farmers change out their coffee whenever they have the money to, which might mean 30 years. The coffee on our farm is probably 35 years old. Some of it is up to the stuff we're starting to replant now. You also saw in the last set of pictures pruning. There's certain parts of care. It's a yearly cycle. Usually it starts, the rains start May 15th. This is like the tradition now with climate change. Everything's gone up in the air, right? May 15th used to be the date when the first rain would fall. That meant that you had a couple months of rainfall. For the ground to be ready, you would have your vivero ready, which was all the little plants there, and you plant them out in June. Every 2 months at least, when they're little, probably every month, you have to go through with the machete and clean all the coffee, because the weeds, it's tropical, weeds will get this tall in like 3 weeks. So you're just constantly going over past the coffee. You have a small machete, it's really easy to handle, and a stick with a crook on it, and you'll kind of just clean along the edge like this, pulling the weeds away, and with your machete cleaning. I'm pretty good at that. A lot of Nicaraguans get surprised because they've never seen a gringo who knows how to use a machete, and then they come to the farm like, oh my God, it's a gringo who knows how to use a machete. But that's a lot of the work really is machete work, keeping the coffee clean because the weeds grow so fast. In Nicaragua, it's generally a very natural agricultural process because Nicaraguan coffee is so old and it's a small farm and they don't have money to put in agrochemicals and stuff like that. So generally what they do is they will plant it the first year, put about a spoonful of something that would be, we would call NPK probably in US terms, right? Basic just nitrogen, potassium, and I can only think of this in Spanish. Anyways, I guess not many other people are ag or they would have yelled it out already. Anyways, just a basic fertilizer. They'll put a teaspoonful of it in once the first year when they plant it and once halfway through the season. And that's basically it for inputs that go into that. Once that coffee has gone 5 years, around November, the coffee starts to turn red. You've seen some pictures of it turning red. There were a couple earlier where the coffee was actually way past ripe and it would lower the quality of the cup. This coffee right here, the nice red coffee is the one that you want. The green coffee will actually be what we call a sour, and he can maybe talk about that a little later. And it'll lower the quality of the coffee. So every day, people come to pick. Usually, coffee is something that's pretty relaxed. On our farm, we have about 15 acres. It used to be run basically by me and my father-in-law. Now that I've left, he and 2 other neighbors kind of work with him. They work from 12 to 6 every day. And so the 3 of them are running the farm. And they can manage that size of a farm. Only about 10 acres of that probably are in coffee. And when it comes October and the plants start turning red, that's actually one of the guys right there, Maraving, and that's one of the other guys over there, Luis. And you go all day, you're picking the coffee into your basket. You get paid by something we call a medio, which is a box that's 10 by 10 by 5 inches deep. And this year, somebody got 17 Cordobas for doing that, which is about 60 couple cents. That was for the picker, just for picking a medio. 2 medios will make what ends up being about a pound of roasted coffee that you would buy here. So the picker got paid about $1.20, $1.30 probably for picking that this year. And at the end of the day, once you've picked it all there, you can see them putting it in the box up there. That's actually a box that has 6 medios, so since they have a lot, they usually do the 6 medio box. Once it gets filled up, people have 2 or 3 of those, and then we'll use the 1 medio box to finish out the remainder. And there's everybody with their sacks, and they're measuring it out. Then, once it's measured out, it gets cleaned. So people will sit, you can see how they're sitting around, they're picking out all the green coffee, and that's to make sure that it's really high quality, ripe coffee that's not gonna give you a bitter flavor in your coffee in the end. That isn't always done in coffee, which is one of the big problems. There's a lot of antagonism in coffee at the Nicaraguan end, at least. And that's kind of because there's big middlemen who buy all the coffee, and poor farmers who usually get paid very little, and so they see that the other guys make plenty of money, and they'll throw in green coffee, trash, leaves, branches, rocks, anything that will add volume to their coffee because they get paid by volume. And it's the same with the pickers. And then the wealthy middlemen usually buy lots of fancy machinery that knows how to separate that automatically, get all the green things out, and get all the beans that are unwholesome or have bug bites, that type of thing out. And so there's a strong antagonism in the coffee culture in the third world between not just the small growers who will give that coffee to middlemen, but then also between the workers often and these large, a lot of coffee is done on small farms, especially in Nicaragua, but there's a lot of big haciendas too. So there's kind of this cultural history of the conquista, of the Spanish guys who'd be given huge tracts of land and kind of do a lot of things that weren't very nice to people. And there's some memory of that in there. And that pattern of relating between people exists quite often. It's a great challenge when you're down there and working with your neighbors, right? The last thing you have to do on a day of picking, once it's been selected, then that's my father-in-law there pouring a little bucket of coffee into our pulper. We found this old pulper that had kind of been rusted apart and wouldn't work anymore, and paid this lady relatively inexpensively for it, and I got all new bearings and fixed it up and welded it. And fortunately, that's the only way we could do it because we didn't have enough capital to really do it. So there's 3 neighbors around my farm who we bought that little machine together, and it's an ecological pulper. It's a vertical pulper, so the coffee falls in, and there's like this little panel with bumps, and it'll rub the cherry off the outside of the coffee. And then it'll categorize it, and then it has a washer, kind of like a spin cycle on a dryer or washing machine. It has a little bit of water shooting in, and coffee's kind of covered in this slimy snot. I don't know if that's the best word to say when we're drinking coffee, but that's what they call it in Spanish. And a little bit of water and fermentation. The traditional way is they would take that coffee, leave it overnight for, depending how warm it is, but usually 12 to 20 hours. That coffee will ferment, then it'll be washed 3 times with a lot of water. This way, basically, we use very little water, and since we have our water tables at 400 meters where we are, we don't really have access to water, so this has been the only way that we were able to pulp at our farm. So that's showing you a little bit of our story and how we're getting the coffee then past the pulping stage. It comes out of that machine in what's called café oro, which is called gold coffee or something, It doesn't translate very well literally, but it's what we would call green coffee in English, and it's usually at about 70% humidity when it comes out of that machine. So before exporting, we got to get it down to 12% humidity so that it can mold or go bad, and so we got to get all the water out of that in order to be able to ship it. Maestro. Drying, milling, and exporting, that's the next stage, and all of that happens in Nicaragua too. Here you can see the coffee when it's coming out. This is called pergamino. It has a hard hull, kind of like rice would have a hull, if anybody's ever seen rice hulls, or wheat as well. And so we usually keep it in that parchment shell, it's called in English, in order to maintain humidity, because that'll help. Just kind of like rice when your cell phone falls in the toilet, you put rice in it because it absorbs or releases humidity depending. This parchment does that for the coffee. And that parchment, that's how we store it. It has to stay that way usually for 2 or 3 months until it's getting ready, because we'll finish the harvest right around January. We'll store it that way for 2 or 3 months. Then we'll send it to a processing mill. Some of the big farms have their own processing mill and do this themselves. But it will be dried out in the sun. It usually needs 4 to 5 days of drying in the sun. Do we have somebody there? You have somebody up in the top right corner. It needs to be raked 5 or 6 times a day, so there's usually one person who's just out pushing a rake all across a big concrete patio, or sometimes it's done on big plastic sheets. And they'll push that coffee around and flip it, and if it's gonna rain, they have to cover it or shovel it all into bags and take it inside. After 5 days have passed and it's down close to 12%, they generally get it to 17%, then store it, and then they'll re-dry it. After 17, it tends to not go bad, then they'll re-dry it down to 12 right before it goes to processing. Processing then happens in these huge plants. In these plants, they'll have these machines that will first chill the coffee, then they will often measure the humidity. They'll look at the percentage of coffee that is bug eaten, the percentage of coffee that came out with defects, the percentage of coffee that came out green, like we talked about earlier, or have black spots. All that has to get separated out. They'll have several machines that do that. One first by density, they'll divide it by size first, then have a density machine which will take grains that are too light, so it means they have some kind of defect probably inside of them that lower their weight, they'll get kicked out. Then it will have them go down the line, and usually generally it's a lot of women kind of will be standing there, and there's a conveyor belt that goes past them. You can see kind of their hand picking to do the final quality control before it gets put in bags and shipped. Goes on the truck and gets sent to a container ship and comes to the US. We actually did that with our coffee for the first time, it must be 3 years? This will be the third, our third shipment just came here like a couple weeks ago. And so we did a little test batch probably 2 years ago, 1,000 pounds from our farm. And that was really a big step for us. It took a lot of time to be able to figure out how to get all that coffee through that process and learn how all the technical details of each part of that. That's what makes it so difficult for small farmers to be able to take their coffee and be able to say, hey, I've got some good coffee, can I sell to you? Because if they get something of a low quality, once you try it, you probably wouldn't want to go back again. So it's a difficult process, and it requires a lot of often capital. That's why it's usually big companies that are doing the middle-sized processing, either from Nicaragua, nationals, or often foreign companies from the US who will do that process and ship. And the middleman then, there'll often be a local middleman in Nicaragua, and then there'll be kind of a shipping middleman perhaps. The local middleman will also even have smaller level middlemen who will go farm to farm and buy them. So what does all that mean? That's kind of, that shipping container there will get it basically to Troy. So I've kind of painted you the picture of exactly what happens to the coffee step by step from when we plant it to when it gets to the ship. Now let's talk a little bit about economics, politics, environment that deal with that. First, let's talk about, this is Troy's part, so I'm not going to go on. Skip through a couple here. Let's skip, if you can skip ahead. Coffee as a commodity, that would be an interesting one. I guess what we'll start with, I'll tell you the story of my neighbors the last couple of years and what's happened with coffee. I can even tell you back 5 or 6 years since I've been doing this. When we first started coffee, all of us had no way to pulp it, had no way to wash it, had no way to dry it. And so there was a local middleman who would show up in a little truck, and he would usually offer us, what the going rate was. There's only one company in our area who buys coffee, so there's a big monopoly. In the northern part of Nicaragua, there's lots of companies, but we're in the south central, and we're in the old traditional growing area, but it's not where it's kind of like the booming business now. So very limited in your options when it comes to that. And so these middlemen would come in and pay really low prices, way under what New York price was. For example, I'll put this year because I still can manage the prices of this year very easily. Flip the screen, I think I have what the commodity prices. I just have some statements that are kind of interesting. Coffee is the second largest world commodity after oil, if you didn't know that. When I learned that, something kind of blew me away. The largest traded commodity in value in the world, only surpassed by oil. Big business. I learned that the hard way trying to get coffee. It's a very cutthroat world. There's also a whole lot of coffee bought, sold, and drank in the world. But almost all of that coffee is consumed, especially the quality coffee, in the US and in Europe. And almost all of that coffee, when I'm talking about almost, it's about 90%, both of where it's produced and both of where it's consumed. So 90% of coffee is, I don't know about the consumer part. 90% of production of coffee happens in the third world. And the other 90%, because these always stick in my head as a pair, the other 90% is 90% of profits from the sales of coffee always stay in the first world. So the place where it's grown doesn't end up with the money from it. They just end up passing that along to people who have the connections here and can make the money off of it. Go ahead and hit the next screen. This is just some basic statistics about US consumption of coffee, the average size of a cup, the average price of a cup, how much output there is. There's a lot of things about output, especially that affect Nicaragua, especially since there's some big countries like Brazil or Vietnam that can put out a lot of low quality coffee, and then that lowers the prices for us in Nicaragua. Go ahead and flip to the next page. I think that's one more. This is the page I'm looking for. This is the price of coffee for during the last year. So when did I tell you guys that coffee harvest was? Can anybody remember? November, December. So let's look at our thing here. Here's $100 for 100 pounds of coffee. So coffee was right at about just over $1 in December on the international commodities price in New York. I was in Nicaragua at that point, and all the local guys who would come by in the little pickups were offering, depending where you are, but from 80 to 95 cents at that point for your coffee. They, usually those little middlemen, what they'll do is they'll go around every day, they'll pick up coffee from 10 or 11 farms, they'll load it up, they'll take it to a big beneficio, and they'll just put it in their name and they get a ticket for a certain amount of coffee. And the big coffee companies will give them a loan, basically, for them to pay out to all the small farmers, because the farmers are hand to mouth. They need food, they need to pay the pickers. You saw remember what the price was for a picker for a pound of coffee this year? It was around 63 cents-ish. So if our farmers are getting 80 to 90 cents, it's giving you an idea for the same pound of coffee that the pickers got paid. For a pound of coffee in green, it's actually 2 medios, so the pickers actually got $1.23. So the picker was making more than what the price of coffee was this year, almost. Not quite true, but almost. And the cost of production was well over what the price was. So you can understand what that meant for small farmers. That was last year. And this year I can tell you about farming in our area and our neighbors and our little farm. There was a huge drought throughout all Central America. And this seems to be have to do something with global warming. Seems to have been, the one thing I can attest to is great changes in not heat or cold, but just the consistency of weather. Whether the rainy season isn't the rainy season anymore, the dry season isn't the dry season anymore. 2 years ago, when this harvest happened, we had almost 13 flowerings of coffee during the dry season because there were just random rains in the middle of the dry season. The coffee needs a rest period. It's kind of this plant that it needs 4 months where it can conserve its energy and get ready to flower, and it gives its harvest once a year. So if it doesn't have that period, it causes all kinds of havoc and problems in the coffee. So 2 years ago, it was raining all the time during the dry season. We had all these flowerings that would appear, and then there wasn't really a water to keep them from falling off. Well, this year, the water just never came. So the whole first harvest was lost. That includes beans, rice, all your traditional crops as well. But since coffee didn't have any water to set the flowers, the crops really, really, really low. So again, we'll probably have really good prices this year, though, is my guess, since there's so little coffee. But we'll have to see. But in general, the prices in the last 3 years, this last year was about $1. 2 years ago, it was about $1.75. Before that, it was about $2, which was one of the highest prices we've had in about 16 years. And then it was hovering around 1 there for a couple of years before that. So it gives you kind of an idea of what the farmer's getting. And all that's just his net. That's his net. It's not looking at what his costs are in general. So that raises a lot of questions for me in terms of coffee. And that's one of the reasons we started looking at, well, how can we get coffee to the U.S.? Because we started seeing, as a farmer, on a good year, we're making 10 to 15 cents a pound. Small farmers, the average around my farm, between me and my neighbors, is probably 3,000 to 4,000 pounds on a good year and 2,000 to 3,000 pounds on a bad year. Coffee is kind of a biennial plant. It will have a very strong year, which is kind of what I was talking about, the good year, and then it'll have, after it gets a little tired, and after that, then it'll have a little bit weaker year. So you could say we average from 3,000 to 3,500 year to year.